And welcome to our latest Squadpod in conversation. I get my words out. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Benjamin Wood. Is it Benjamin? Am I calling you Benjamin or Ben or?
You can call me either. It doesn't matter. It says Benjamin on the front of my books, but you can call me
Yeah.
Ben for the purposes of this.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, well I'll call you Ben. I mean, if you're particularly tied to Benjamin, I can call you Benjamin, but Ben is
No,
good for
that's
me.
fine.
So
Everyone else
Ben,
calls me Ben.
so Ben's book, Seascraper, is out this week on Thursday. Is that right?
And it comes out on the 17th of
Oh, it's
July,
next. Yeah. So
officially.
that's. Oh no, that's a week, isn't it? Yeah, a week's time.
Yeah.
So yeah. So it's a little book, but it certainly packs a punch. There's a lot
Okay.
going on in it. So would you like to introduce yourself and also the book?
Yeah. I'm Benjamin Wood, as we've already established. I've written 5 literary novels, Seascraper being my fifth and most recent. Um, I've been going at this for a fair old time. I also teach creative writing currently at King's College London, where I founded the PhD in creative writing program as well, which is producing some exciting alumni. So Seascraper, yeah, this is the hardback edition,
Oh,
which
nice. Yes, that is
comes out
nice.
soon. Um, is about a young man called Thomas Flett who has inherited his grandfather's way of life as a cart shanker. So that is an old-fashioned kind of shrimper who goes out onto the beach dragging a net along the shallows to catch as many shrimp as he possibly can. While he's out there, he can only go out there at most twice a day, 2 low tides a day. So Seascraper um, follows about a day and a half in the life of Thomas, um, and it captures a moment where the trajectory of his life is about to change. An American enters into his vicinity unexpectedly, promising various things. Thomas has always had aspirations of being a folk singer, or at least he's got kind of burgeoning aspirations to become one. He hasn't quite tested himself out yet, but he's secretly harboring them away from his mother, who he lives with. And yeah, it's as you said, it's a short novel. It's the shortest novel I've written, but I've always wanted to write one that's short and sweet, and hopefully this one's it.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, sweet. Definitely, there's not some sweet bits in it, which
Yeah,
um, but actually it's really gritty, and I think the setting and the atmosphere for me is apparent really from the really early pages, that you feel like you're sort of, you know, within that life that he has. It's tough, it's bleak, it's not forgiving in any shape or form, is it, what he does?
no, it's a hard life.
So how did that sort of, what was the inspiration for the book?
Well, it's a fictionalized version of my hometown. I grew up on the northwest coast in a town called Southport, um, and I had always, as a kid, you know, gone to the beach, and there's a very unusual, unique thing about the beach at Southport is that the tide stays out quite far,
Mm.
and at least once a year, people fool themselves into thinking they can walk from Southport to Blackpool
Oh, really?
across the beach and get themselves into trouble. So yeah, I knew that when I was writing this book that I wanted to write about home in a sense,
Yeah.
the place I grew up. I wanted to write about the north, and I didn't really want to write particularly about Southport itself, but to build from my memories of the place and to try
Mhm.
and create a kind of stylized, slightly scaled down version of it that I could amplify the atmosphere of for various dramatic effects. I think I tend to write novels which have a quite contained, slightly claustrophobic atmosphere
Mm.
to them. So I wanted to use that. And I built the novel really from a memory I had from throughout my youth, and when I went to live in Canada for a few years as in my older times. I I took this sort of memory with me of a shed on wheels, which we would always sort of see parked up on the beach in Southport. And I sort of knew what it was. It was, people would go out and catch shrimp, but I didn't really think of it too much beyond that. And then when I started thinking about writing about, the place I'm from more, this memory kept
Yeah.
resurfacing. So I did a bit of investigation into what exactly it was, and then that led me down into a train of research into the shrimping industry in the town of, a lot of which I didn't know anything about. And then, people right back from, sort of the early 1900s and before, when men would go out barefoot on the beach with just a net, walking out in
Yeah.
all kinds of crazy conditions. Um, Built up to the time which is when they would do it with a horse and a cart, which is in the novel, Thomas has learnt that way of life from his grandfather, and
Mm.
he's really, in the time that this novel is set, the sort of the last holdout of that tradition at a time when it's long been sort of mechanized. So yeah, that was its
Yeah.
genesis really. Memory and yeah, the will to find drama in what had always felt to me a sort of mundane or quotidian aspect of my life.
Yeah. Because I think the book's quite timeless, isn't it? Although it's sort of, it alludes to certain things, because when I started reading it, I thought it was much earlier. I thought that it was, and I don't know if that was on purpose from you, so that you. But then, as you start to get through the book, you sort of drop things in, which is sort of more popular culture of that time, and and yeah, that's sort of, because I thought, is this like set like way back? But then it starts to materialize as the book goes on that it's not. It's actually, much more modern than I thought it was.
Yeah, that's definitely what I wanted it to feel like. So I'm glad that you did. I didn't want to time stamp it,
No,
with a date at the beginning or anything like that. I wanted it to feel slightly out of time, stuck in time is probably a better
yeah,
way of
that's a
putting
good
it.
description. Yeah,
So that the beginning part of the book feels like you could be you're not really sure about what period it is because of the sort of job that Thomas is doing out there. It could be, from any sort of century.
yeah,
And then as the book goes on, details start to coalesce to form a clearer picture of what time and place it is without it ever really being stated. But there are or there should be enough
yeah.
clues in there for you to locate it within reality.
Which is quite nice in a literary fiction as well, because I mean, I read a lot of crime, and I read a lot of different types of books, but actually, quite often they are very sort of, you know, specific about the time that it's set in, and I quite liked that. I think it actually helped with the atmosphere, as particularly, sort of, I'll come back to in a second, but about the relationship with his mum, that felt quite sort of old fashioned as well. I think there's quite a lot in it that, and because I guess the job is so, like, he's carrying on his granddad's job, and he hasn't modernized it in any shape or form, has he? So
No,
yeah,
not really. But it's also, set in a period when, particularly in the north, the country was still recovering from, a lot of economic turbulence
yeah,
post-war, and there were a lot of slums in the north, still what they used to call the slums, um, and a lot of people who really didn't have a lot still didn't have, running water in, or a bath in the bathroom or anything
yeah.
like that. So it's reflective of a kind of a hardship that existed and was, I think quite widespread without it being hopefully too much of a kitchen sink sort of a grim up north uh, cliche.
It was because the whole fog thing as well. Because my family come from Scarborough, which is a little
Mm,
bit down the
yeah,
a bit down the coast from Blackpool, and my gran was went to Blackpool in the war, so she always talked about. So,
yeah,
and I always remember the foghorn going off at Scarborough, and my family were fishermen, so that sort of really gritty sort of, my uncles were winklers, and so I really sort of really enjoyed that side of it, because it's not something that I'm familiar with at all, apart from the fact that I knew they did it.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that I was, that I knew very much about at all. And I always like that in a book, if there's something that
Yeah.
you learn as well.
Yeah. I think there was lots that I learned in writing it as well. I
Yeah,
mean, there's some very specific terminology to that particular region of shrimp fishermen, which isn't used in other places where they, catch shrimp in similar ways. So um, I try to embrace as many of those specificities as I could because, as a novelist, I would say that um, the specifics, the details of people's working lives, the kind of novel I write, which tend to be surrounding working class characters, that is the absolute fabric of
yeah,
truth, and that's what you're aiming for, is to give the reader a sense of the reality of what it would have been like without, it being too didactic or too preachy.
yeah.
Um,
Because he's sort of, when I was interested in Thomas actually as a character as well. So how did he sort of come in the process of writing? Did he sort of come later on after you sort of got the idea of was it sort of setting and sort of
Yeah,
plot?
setting was sort of I would say the beginning for me, knowing where it was going to locate it. I can't really write a novel unless I know where I'm setting it,
Yeah,
and that the setting has a sufficient atmosphere to sustain the novel. But Thomas, once I alighted on the notion of a cart shanker, of a kind of a young man who's still sort of clinging to the traditions that he's inherited, but might want to be something else, I sort of saw that as a little bit of I could find my way to understanding who that character was, and it became, I think, a more personal book than I was expecting. Not that I was, up at the crack of dawn and out at ebb tide to catch shrimp, but more that I remember feeling a kind of sense of both belonging and dislocation from where I grew up, because I was a creative person, and sort of knew that in order to pursue what I wanted to, I might eventually have to pursue it elsewhere, move away
yeah,
where the opportunities were. And I think I tried to build Thomas's viewpoint from that, understanding that I had at that age.
mm,
So Thomas is an aspiring folk singer. And yeah, when I was probably about 14, I started going to sing in folk clubs. Um, and I knew that I could write his character with enough verisimilitude because I understood his position, and I also understood what those rooms were like. I didn't know what they were like in 1963, which is when
no.
the book is set, but I, I
I
could
imagine
I
some
could
of them
place
haven't
myself
changed that
there.
much.
Yeah, probably not, but I could certainly place myself there. And I think I know that's a lot of what I do in fiction, is try and, if I can locate myself in the story and in
Yeah,
the character, then I can do um, what I would call a kind of empathetic projection into the space of the story, into the period, through research and through other things. And I tried to build Thomas as much from my own personal perspective as I could,
mm,
and trying to think back to what it was like
what it was
when I
like.
was
Yeah.
20, which is hard.
Yeah. You want to try being my age and remembering that far back. Um, we talked about just briefly about the relationship with him and his mum. So her ma, she's a single mum, isn't she? She's brought him up
Mm,
with the granddad. He's never really known his dad, and they do. There is part of the book is sort of developing that sort of, where he sort of came into it, and
yeah.
actually part of the story of those 2 days, isn't it? Is he does actually find out more about his dad and his mum in that time, when after Edgar, who's the guy from America, comes along. That's when he sort of starts to sort of dig a bit deeper, isn't it? And then something
Mm,
happens which triggers him. I think that's probably the best way to say it.
yeah.
Him to look into that deeper.
Yeah. He has a relationship with his mother in the book where she's not much older than he is. You know, she's sort of,
No.
and that creates a kind of tension um, between them, which she's a bit unaware of, and he's increasingly aware of. And you know, there's a very close knit quality, almost suffocating quality to their relationship at times, but it's one of very much of mutual support.
Yeah.
Thomas does what he does because there's no other means of income. So he kind of sacrifices a lot of his ambitions and I guess his own sort of desires in many respects to support her as best as he can with the limited means that he's got. He's an intelligent lad, though. He's sort of had to give up school. So
Yeah, that was really sad, that part of it, when he,
there's
because he,
a, yeah, and he's an erudite, you know, character in many ways, and he can't, no matter what he does to sort of doggedly pursue the working life that he's inherited,
mm,
he can't snuff out the flame of ambition that's there
yeah,
for him, I think, and that's really what, you know, this book increasingly starts to pursue. It draws in strands of, yeah, family life, and you know, his father who he hasn't known, and there's a a strong connection between father son, mother son in the book, which is kind of bookended um, with the two characters, the two main characters in it as
yeah,
well, and so it's that certainly a story which I set out wanting to write about family as well, because I'm not really, apart from my third novel, which is a very dark investigation of a family. This one doesn't really. This one tries to sort of speak to the more recognizable traits of a close knit family, particularly a
yeah,
close knit northern family. I think, which is one of kind of grudging acceptance of each other, which is actually the way that you express your fondness for each other.
yeah, yeah. Having a northern mother
Yeah,
and grandmother, yeah, I think it's definitely very different than the South where I was born. That it's sort of completely completely different of that sort of southern upbringing that my
mm,
dad's family are from, and then the
yeah,
northern side that my mum's side is from. So
yeah,
yeah, it's really interesting. I think that sort of suffocation sort of thing as well is, and almost that sort of bickering that goes on, is very normal.
yeah,
It felt very normal, and actually, some people I guess might read it and think they haven't got a very good relationship, but actually they did. They're very, you know,
yeah,
very, like I say, very supportive of each other.
yeah.
Um, and she was young, wasn't she? You know, she was really young when she had him.
Hmm.
You know, so she's 36 in the book, and he's in his
He's
sort of 20s.
20.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so she was very young. But appear when you first when you first start to read her, I thought she was a lot older.
yeah,
And so she's sort of timeless as well within the book. Um, and I thought the sort of interesting relationship between because you said like the granddad is the father, isn't he? He's the father figure in the book. Um, but yeah, that sort of obligation he has, I guess,
yeah.
to
That's a good
to
word for it.
to look after his mum and be the man of the house. I guess he doesn't shirk away from that, although he doesn't really want it.
No, he's a very loyal character,
Yeah,
and you know, he I think will remain as loyal as he can possibly be before he realizes that something has to give in his life. And yeah, I wanted to present him as that kind of person, not as somebody who's conscious all the time of his frustration, but
yeah,
who is loyal to the, sort of the pursuit, and has invested a lot of time and effort in sustaining his existence. But something happens in his life in the duration of this book where almost a window in his mind is open to something
Yeah.
different, and that's enough for him to realize that what he has isn't necessarily long term what he
No.
wants.
So Edgar, he was that was quite an interesting sort of, so you've got all this sort of grit and, grime, and then Hollywood comes in quite unexpectedly, and quite sort of full, quite, all of a sudden he's sort of almost sort of
Yeah, he just
dragged.
dropped into his living room.
Yeah. So how did that come about in the writing? Because that's, it's a really interesting turn of events, but I wondered how Edgar and his sort of the side of the Hollywood film
Yeah,
industry sort of came in.
um, I'm trying to remember um, the beginnings of that. Really, I will always look to establish an equilibrium for my characters, and then try and disrupt that equilibrium as soon as I can, so that and
Yeah,
give the reader a sense from the beginning that something's not quite right in this world. Edgar's arrival is the disruptor of the equilibrium, I would say, and I always knew, I think, as I was writing the first scene with Thomas at the beach, that when he gets home, somebody's going to be there.
yeah,
I didn't know for a while who that person would be, um, and how I would go about writing it. So I think in the early part of writing this, that's sort of, I remember writing the first long sequence and then bringing him home and then getting a bit stuck for a bit, as I
yeah,
remember, and then doing a lot of pondering about who this character might be, and then realizing who it was and having a kind of epiphany is too strong a word, but
yeah,
a sudden moment where I realized, I could do this. Um, and yeah, his character is, built from, yeah, I guess I just have a strong love of cinema and auteurs of cinema. So he's built, is this sort of a hybrid of so many different
yeah,
um, characters of Hollywood of a certain era, which no longer really exists. The idea that he sees himself as a director who has wants to have final cut, free reign over all of
yeah,
his projects creatively. Um, so I enjoyed, yeah, building on, what I knew of, you know, directors like Michael Cimino and Stanley Kubrick,
yeah.
and trying to build out my own version of a character like that. It was fun.
Because he's really I don't want to give away too much, so it's difficult to say, but he has surprises as well.
Mm.
So he's not as, again, as straightforward as you maybe think he is, and
Yeah,
I think,
nobody in the book is as straightforward as you think they
no,
are.
I like that. I like that because I think that's, I think when you're, I always think you want to be surprised in a book anyway, regardless of what genre it is. It's
Yeah,
nice to have that sort of, I don't know, surprise is the right word, but just for it not to be exactly how you think it's going to turn out, because I mean that would be boring,
yeah, yeah. And I knew that this was going to be a short book, so the kind of reversals of expectation that exist
Yeah,
in this book would be important. So yeah, I gave them a lot of thought.
and I never thought his story, which I can't say what it is, but I
Mhm.
never saw that coming at all. So I was really
That's good.
interested,
I'm glad. I
really
did my work
interested
well.
how that just goes. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So is that
that's
something that
good.
you really like to bring into your writing? Is that sort of, that sort of, not, that element of, it's almost sleight of hand, isn't it? It's like, this is going, because you
Yeah,
do, yeah,
I've done. I mean, it depends what the project is, I suppose, but I've done it. I've done it before, so I knew I could do it again.
that's good.
um, my second novel, The Ecliptic, has a kind of a major sort of, guess you call it a twist. I didn't
I was
really
going to
see
say
it that way,
you
but
would call it a twist in a sort of a crime
yeah,
thriller, but yeah, but I guess it still is,
yeah.
regardless of.
It's a what happens is that things don't turn out completely as you
I
expect
think
them
you're
to.
going to,
So
yeah,
all the all the signs that you've read along the way on the journey, which are pointing you in a direction, suddenly are not pointing you where you thought you were going.
Yeah.
I enjoy that experience as a reader, so I try and, if I have an opportunity
To do
um,
that.
to do that in a novel, whether it's as something as extreme as I did in The Ecliptic, my second book, or whether it's something slightly more downplayed and subtle, um, then good. I will always I will always try and write a novel which is compelling, as compelling narratively as it
Yeah.
can be. That's the kind of novel I enjoy. I think reading the most is one which feels, very elegantly composed at sentence level, but which is also giving me a kind of a pulse of narrative to follow,
Yeah.
even if it's not, you know, a racing plot. It's still something as steady and simple as, the path of one character towards his or her ambition. One of my favorite and really underrated novels is by a crime writer called James M. Cain, who wrote Double Indemnity. But his novel Mildred Pierce is utterly brilliant. It's really about a single mother raising her two children while trying to start her own chicken restaurant, and it's just so compelling,
I've
especially
heard
the
that
scenes
name,
in
but I don't
particular.
know. I've not read it, but I don't know why I've heard
It
of.
was made into a series with
Was it?
Kate Winslet.
Maybe that's where I
It isn't quite as compelling as
as the book.
the novel is, although it's rarely the case that it is. But it was a very well made series. But yeah, I really recall the experience of reading that novel and just how it was able to keep me wrapped in what was going to happen next at the restaurant. And what
Yeah.
I I try and emulate um, things like that in my own work, where I feel a strong connection to a story, and wherever
Mm.
the stories that I remember scenes from, or remember being so deeply ingrained in as a reader, I try as much as I can to remember what was it about that book that I enjoyed so much, and what can I do a version of that myself? Can I find a character who's just as alive
Yeah.
and real as this one is?
Because your day job is writing as well, as you said. You teach creative writing, and sort of how does that sort of, are you able to sort of separate the two? Is it sort of like when you're at work, you've got your teaching head on, but or does that sort of come in? Is it difficult for?
Um, I would say, since I've had children, it's become harder and harder to partition myself in that way.
Yeah,
Um, because you're always in a battle to sort of seize the moments. You've got to be creative when you
yeah,
have two small children, um, and that's not their fault at all. It's just a matter of practicality.
yeah,
So when it comes to teaching, I tend to try and, yeah, the only way I've really found to partition myself is to sort of say, I'm teaching now for this term. So my term starts, September, ends in December,
yeah,
and I won't really attempt to do anything um, with my own work in that time. I just have to, because of the amount of feedback that I have to give undergraduate,
yeah,
postgraduate stuff, as well as all other responsibilities that come with being an academic. They tend to be so, yeah, exhausting that
yeah,
you you
yeah,
end up um, yeah, not really having the will to, or your productivity when you have the moments to pursue it isn't what you want it to be, and then you get frustrated with yourself. So I've sort of found in the last 4 or 5 years to just sort of say, I'm teaching now, and then I'll
yeah,
start once the term is over, or when you get periods of research leave, or things that come along. It is getting more and more difficult to balance the two lives. The more students that we have, the more
yeah,
feedback there is to give, and I enjoy it. I enjoy doing it, but it does take a good deal of my own sort of editorial energy.
Yeah, and I imagine like because I mean it's like anybody who's creative got a creative thing and they have to go to work and do and also do the mundane life stuff. That does drain your creativity, doesn't it? To give you that headspace of being able to go to where you
Yeah,
maybe would have gone before
I
kids, before work, before anything.
yeah, I think I've just found as I've got older that and I have more and more responsibilities, which are important responsibilities outside of just my professional
Yeah,
life. So yeah, teaching becomes a matter of I want to teach well. I want to do my best,
yeah,
and I can't really give anything but my best. So if I feel like I'm not giving my best to teaching, then I may as well not do it. Um,
yeah,
so I always try and compartmentalize myself that way, and just say, well, this period is for this period
yeah.
is for this, and then give my all in the periods that I've got. But increasingly, yeah, it becomes harder and harder to find the moments to be creative, and that creates frustration. But I found a way to do it up till this point. So I'm just,
That's good. So
but the
how
books are getting shorter.
yeah, well, that's going to say because you this is your fifth book, you said. So how how long is that over? What sort of period has that been over the five books? Is that quite a short period?
Well, no, not really. My first novel came out in 2012. So
Okay, so
it came out when I was 30, but I finished writing it when I just turned 28, and it took 2 years for it to, once it was sold to the publisher, they waited 2 years to bring it out. So yeah, and I've been teaching really since that time. So I've been teaching nearly 20 years and writing at the same time. So 5 books out since the age of 30 and 44. So, and
that's not,
with a 3 year sort of COVID
yeah. Oh yeah,
hell in the
that
middle.
little that joy. It's but yeah, it's funny how it's sort of gone, but still there, isn't it? With you said
Yeah.
about so the writing so basically then when you're not teaching that's when you sort of commit yourself to your own writing to your sort of
It's
novels
when I
and
will commit myself fully to it. Yeah. I mean, I will always carry around notebooks
yeah
with me, and I'll always be thinking of what I want to do next. And if I've started the early stages of something, I'll always be thinking about it. You know, there's a kind of a maxim in creative writing tuition that some instructors give that I don't ever give to my students, which is the idea that you must always be writing something every day. If you're not writing something every day, then you can't consider yourself to be a writer. I've found that to be apocryphal, really. I think it's much better to be thinking about something creatively every day.
yeah
That's productive, but it's not productive to just produce
words
words for the sake of
yeah
splurging out words to say, oh, I did something today, because you'll end up with just a mountain of stuff which has no end point. And it's better to have a kind of targeted creative thought
yeah,
process, even if you're not actually putting anything on the page. That's what I found
yeah
is
that's really
is
interesting
my
because
process.
I find that with writing is that I don't have the headspace to do it every day but I do think
Yeah,
about stuff when I'm not so actually that makes me feel a lot better
good.
because yeah I don't always have the inclination or time or whatever it is but quite often when I'm driving to work I'll think of something and think oh yeah that's not a bad idea
Hmm.
because that's when my
And
head is clear. It's not
yeah,
thinking about work it's just thinking about being stuck in traffic.
yeah, and it's absolutely true that any time I've ever, been blocked or needed the answer to something that I'm working on, and a period where I'm actively not thinking about it always allows the answer to
Yeah,
surface. And and it will often surface when you're doing things like washing the dishes, or you know
yeah,
walking to collect your children, or stuff like that. Whereas if you just sit there constantly thinking
trying
about
to
it,
think
it
yeah
won't produce anything. So yeah, creativity is mysterious and elusive, and
it is.
that's why we like it.
So are you would you class yourself as a big plotter? Are you you know you said that you like to know where it is, but is that where your setting is? Is that are you sort of more sort of fluid with how it goes really?
Um, I think the longer that I've done it, I'm probably a little bit more trusting and fluid. But to be honest, uh, yeah, plot is probably the aspect of novel writing which, um, if anything, I feel is a kind of an innate skill that I might have. I don't mean to sound that. What I mean is, it's the probably the part that I have to think about the least, because the kind of person I am is like, I'm very good at finding order in chaos. So and I love finding order in chaos. So the part of writing I enjoy the most is thinking about a story, thinking about its arc, what happens in Act One, what happens in Act Two, what happens in Act Three,
Yeah,
how close to the story I can start, where I'm going to leave the reader at the end. And I do a lot of that plotting really just in my head without much note taking. Once I've got the idea for that and pretty much set, I then start to write down the details of it. But I think the way I go about it is more, now, sort of since the, let's say, the third novel I wrote, I would sort of say, this is what the most dramatic part of the story is I want to reach. This is where I'm beginning, as close to it as I can, or in its aftermath, or wherever I'm beginning. And then I allow myself to, yeah, a bit more instinctively write each section towards that moment in the distance.
yeah,
And I think, um, if the story digresses, deviates in interesting ways on its way towards that path that are unexpected, I'll allow it to do that.
yeah,
And sometimes I'll go back and rein it back in and say, well, that digression was a cul-de-sac.
yeah,
Um, and I think, learning, the longer that you do it, which digressions are the cul-de-sacs and which
yeah,
are the ones to fruitfully pursue are, that's half of the job, really.
yeah,
And the part of writing I always enjoy most anyway is just tinkering with the sentence I wrote last. I don't really enjoy the process of imagining the first line or the first paragraph. I like having a paragraph to then fix and keep keep
interesting.
reworking
Yeah,
until I'm happy line by line. So that's really, my process is relatively slow in the sense that, I start from the first line, keep rewriting that first line until I'm happy with it, and then the second line, do the same, and then I'll rewrite the first line again, and then the second line again. And so it's quite a sort of tidal process in many ways.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that's quite intense because I mean, obviously, if you're writing a 1,000 page book, that's going to take a while. Um,
yeah, it does. I'm not advocating for it as a not advocating for the efficacy of it, but it gets done somehow,
yeah,
just not quickly.
no. What do you who has been an inspiration for you writing wise?
I mean, many, many writers of all different, kinds, really. I would point to, I think my early inspirations in writing were all songwriters. So that's what I wanted to be when I was in my teens. And, I don't think I would be a writer today didn't, if I wasn't inspired by Tom York, Radiohead's lyrics, and
Yeah,
Michael Stipe of REM's lyrics, and Elliott Smith, and Paul Simon, um, Paul McCartney. That they were my early beginnings. And then I think, there was a science fiction and thriller writer called Michael Marshall Smith. Sometimes he uses the Smith, sometimes he doesn't. Who I absolutely loved and still do. And he's someone who really supported me in my early life in ways, and I'll always be grateful to him. Um, and I had a great, um, teacher when I was doing a strange creative course at the University of Central Lancashire, which is where I went, called Ailsa Cox, and she gave me a lot of support, and she was the one who introduced me to a lot of literary fiction, which I'd never really encountered before. She was the one who gave me a copy of Donna Tartt's The Secret History and said, "Have you read
Such a
that?"
book.
And
Yeah.
so I owe a lot to her as well. And then I think my own creative or my own spark in fiction came from one day I remember being in Southport and it started to throw down with rain, and it was like really heaving it down. And the only place I could go in for shelter was WH Smith's. This isn't an advert for WH Smith's, but anyway, I went upstairs to my local branch in Southport, where the music and the books were.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing a copy of Paul Auster's New York trilogy sort of standing out from the shelf. And I thought that looks a bit like the cover of OK Computer by Radiohead. And oh, let's go. And I picked that up and started reading New York trilogy and just was absolutely overcome with like, whoa, you can do this in a book. And I read a lot of what Paul Auster, everything he's written. I found him, yeah, an amazing inspiration. I was very lucky enough to meet him before, a few years before he died, and yeah, so he's an early inspiration. And then
Mm.
a lot of writers since then. I like a lot of American writers tend to be my influences.
Mm.
Truman Capote. I love Richard Yates. I love, there's a writer called Wallace Stegner whose novels I really love. Marilyn Robinson's Home is a novel I absolutely think is masterful. But then, Hilary Mantel. I
Yeah.
think her short stories are the greatest short stories ever written by an English writer, and I teach them every year, and I get more and more out of them every time I look at them. So yeah, I mean, I could go on all day, really.
Yeah, no,
James
I mean
Baldwin.
that's an amazing list. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to the end of the chat, but what's next for you?
I'm not really sure at the moment. I mean, I'm in the auditioning stage with myself where it's like I've got all of these various projects that I'm keen to
Yeah.
pursue, but I'm also in a phase of my life where I'm trying to more yeah, be a bit more active about all the aspects of the creativity that I haven't really followed as much as I
Yeah.
want to over the years because of various other things. But so I'll definitely be writing another novel soon. I don't know yet which. I've sort of got
Some
some
ideas.
ideas that
Yeah.
I'm trying to decide where I want to invest my time over the coming years. I'm taken by the idea of writing a kind of a cycle of books in and around the same character or the same place at the moment. So I might consider that. Um, and yeah, various other things. But I would say I'm still in the moment, which I always go through really after I've finished the book. I always really wait for it to come to the point where I feel like its publishing sort of phase has
Yeah.
finished, which is normally sort of towards the end of the hardback review phase or whatever that is, and then absolutely commit to the next one. So yeah, I'm still um,
You're still in that sort of the publication. Well, you haven't got to publication day yet. There's a couple of
no,
weeks.
it's
So
still a few weeks to go, and I find it very hard to um, entirely commit to something new until I feel like the life of the other book has reached
yeah.
a point where I can have some closure on it.
That's
Um,
interesting because some people have already moved on to the next one already, and I think that's quite different, for different people. Like some people, like yourself, where they're just like, no, this is what I'm on. But then I guess some people who have got deadlines for 2 or 3 books a year, which I don't know
yeah,
how people do that. They're like
I
literally on
mean,
to the next second or the next one before they've,
Yeah.
you know, and that's quite hard because when you speak to people, you know, quite often they're like they have moved on from that one. So when they have to come to do this sort of stuff, it's like
Yeah.
that was got done 2 years ago, sort of thing.
I think writing novels is increasingly um, immersive for me in the sense that I have to give a lot of myself to each project, like my
Mm.
emotional self, I think.
Yeah.
So it's slightly different in various different forms of writing. I think I could probably write screenplay after screenplay after screenplay without feeling I need to, find
Yeah.
it closure on the other one. But novels, you know, to me are kind of about the representation of a character's consciousness or
Mm.
personality, and I find it that I have to allow breathing space in between
Yeah.
to really do it justice the next time. Which again, I'm not campaigning for this as a means of doing it well or the right way. It's just how
Yeah.
I've gone
Well, that's
about
the
it.
thing, isn't it? As well, is it's so personal to each person. There is no, I guess, as a creative writing teacher as well, to say that there is no way.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's the first thing I will say to any of my students. There are no hard and fast rules or
Yeah.
expected ways of going about it, and each and every person who commits words to a page has their own
Yeah.
unique thing to say, even if they're all writing the same story and saying it in different ways.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been
Thank
great.
you for having me. Thank you for
And
reading it.
thank you for introducing me to Thomas and his interesting life, because what starts off to be bleak doesn't, does, as we said, you'll be surprised as you go
Yeah, it should
along.
be hopeful,
Yeah.
hopefully, I think.
Yes, it
And
is hopeful.
yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, if you can introduce Thomas to as many people as you can, I'd
I will
appreciate it.
indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. Now I've got to just try to turn this off.